The warm afternoon sun streamed through the airport's giant glass windows as Dr. Maya Thompson walked confidently toward the Sky Lounge, her wheeled carry-on gliding smoothly behind her. After performing a challenging 6-hour heart surgery, she was looking forward to some quiet time before her flight to a medical conference in Chicago. She'd done this routine hundreds of times before. Flash her platinum membership card, smile at security, and enjoy the peaceful sanctuary of the VIP lounge. Today felt different, though. The moment she approached the entrance, she noticed Officer Barrett's eyes following her every move, his expression hardening as she got closer. "Membership card and ID," he said curtly, not matching her polite smile. Maya reached into her designer handbag, pulling out both items with practiced ease. The platinum card caught the sunlight, its holographic surface showing her elite status clear as day. "Additional documentation needed," Officer Barrett announced, his tone carrying an edge that made nearby travelers turn their heads. "We need to verify your membership status." Maya's heart sank as she watched a string of other travelers walk past her into the lounge. A quick nod from Officer Barrett, a casual glance at their cards, that's all it took for them. But here she stood, fumbling through her bag for extra papers she'd never needed before. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the frustration building inside her. She was exhausted from surgery, her feet ached in her comfortable but professional heels, and all she wanted was to sit down with a cup of hot tea. "Standard procedure," Officer Barrett replied, though his eyes told a different story. Maya noticed his badge number as he shifted his weight, 7456. She'd learned long ago to pay attention to such details. Through the glass walls of the lounge, she could see people settling into plush chairs, sipping drinks, and typing on laptops. A businessman who had arrived after her was already helping himself to the buffet. The contrast wasn't lost on her, or on the growing number of onlookers. Maya took a deep breath, remembering her father's words, "Your dignity is your armor." With steady hands, she pulled out her phone and began recording, not confrontational, just documenting. "Officer, I've been a platinum member for 5 years. I travel weekly for my work as a cardiothoracic surgeon. Could you please explain why I need additional verification today?" Her question hung in the air, professional but pointed. A few travelers slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. Among them, a customer service manager appeared, her quick steps bringing her closer to the developing situation. The Florida heat seemed to intensify through the airport's massive windows, but Maya stood her ground, her surgeon's calm never wavering. This wasn't just about getting into a lounge anymore. It was about standing up to the subtle discriminations that chipped away at dignity, one random check at a time. In her mind, she wasn't just Dr. Maya Thompson anymore. She was every person who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong in spaces they'd earned their right to be in. And today, she decided, something had to change. The phone felt warm in Maya's hand as she continued recording, her medical conference presentation forgotten for now. She'd learned long ago that documentation was protection, though she never thought she'd need it in a place like this. Around her, the usual hurried pace of airport life had slowed, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "I've shown you my platinum card and my ID," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in the operating room. "I'd like to understand what additional documentation you need." Her words were clear, but not confrontational. She'd seen too many situations spiral out of control when emotions ran high. A young woman with a backpack stopped nearby, pretending to check her phone while watching the scene unfold. An elderly couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads. The incident was drawing attention, but Maya kept her focus on Officer Barrett, whose face had turned a shade redder. "We've had issues with fraudulent memberships," he muttered, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. Maya noticed his hands fidgeting with the radio on his belt, a telltale sign of discomfort she recognized from years of reading patient body language. Just then, the customer service manager approached, her quick steps echoing on the polished floor. Her name tag read Linda, and her expression showed she'd already assessed the situation. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, glancing between Maya and Officer Barrett. Maya took this moment to pull up her Sky Lounge app, displaying her membership history. "I was just showing Officer Barrett my credentials," she explained, her tone professional. "I've been a member since 2019, but today seems different from my usual check-in process." Linda's eyes widened slightly as she looked at Maya's profile on the app. "Dr. Thompson, the cardiac surgeon?" She turned to Officer Barrett. "She's one of our most frequent visitors. I've seen her name on our VIP list many times." The atmosphere shifted. Other travelers who'd been waved through earlier now looked uncomfortable, some averting their eyes, others watching with growing understanding. A younger officer nearby began walking toward them, perhaps sensing the tension. Maya stayed steady, her surgeon's composure never wavering. She thought about all the times she'd stood in operating rooms, making split-second decisions that could save lives. This moment felt different, but just as important. It wasn't about saving a life, but about standing up for dignity. "I don't want to cause any trouble," Maya said, meaning it. "I just want to be treated with the same respect as every other Platinum member." Her words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were true. Linda stepped forward, taking control of the situation. "Dr. Thompson, please, let me escort you into the lounge myself." She turned to Officer Barrett, her expression professional but firm. "We'll need to review our check-in protocols after this." As Maya finally moved toward the lounge entrance, she heard whispers of support from other travelers. A small nod from an elderly black woman near the water fountain spoke volumes. A silent acknowledgement of a shared experience, a quiet appreciation for standing firm. Inside her chest, Maya's heart was racing, but her steps were steady. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with loud voices or angry words, but with quiet dignity and an unwavering spirit. As she crossed the threshold into the lounge, she knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning of something bigger than herself. By the time Maya's flight landed in Chicago, her phone was buzzing nonstop. Someone had posted a clip of the incident online, and it had spread like wildfire. She watched the numbers climb as she waited for her luggage, 10,000 views, then 50,000, then hundreds of thousands. The comment section was flooded with similar stories from travelers across the country. "Just another day at the airport," one comment read, followed by a sad face emoji. But this time, someone was brave enough to record it. Maya sat in the back of her taxi, watching the Chicago skyline come into view through the window. Her fingers hovered over her phone as news outlets requested interviews. She'd never wanted to become the face of anything. She just wanted to catch her flight in peace. But now she had a choice to make. The airport authorities' response came swiftly. By the next morning, they'd issued a statement announcing Officer Barrett's administrative leave pending investigation. Maya read it over breakfast in her hotel room, her conference presentation notes spread out beside her untouched coffee. "We take these allegations seriously," the statement read. But Maya knew from experience that taking something seriously wasn't the same as making real change. She thought about the elderly woman's nod at the airport, about all the silent nods and knowing looks she'd received throughout her career. Her phone rang. It was the airport's chief of operations. "Dr. Thompson," he began, his voice careful and measured. "We'd like to offer our sincerest apologies for your experience." He paused, probably expecting her to jump in with demands or threats of legal action. Instead, Maya took a deep breath and said something that surprised even her. "I'd like to request a meeting. Not to point fingers, but to discuss solutions." She stirred her now cold coffee, remembering how her mother always said that anger burns bridges, but wisdom builds them. The silence on the other end lasted a moment before he responded. "We'd welcome that opportunity, Dr. Thompson." Back in her hotel room after her morning conference session, Maya opened her laptop and started drafting ideas. She wasn't interested in just getting one officer suspended. She wanted real, lasting change. Her email inbox was filling up with messages from other professionals sharing similar experiences, each one reinforcing her resolve. A news alert popped up on her screen. More airports were starting to examine their security protocols. What happened to her was becoming a catalyst for a larger conversation. She thought about Officer Barrett, wondering if he understood the ripple effect his actions had created. That evening, as she prepared for her keynote speech on innovative cardiac procedures, Maya added a new slide to her presentation. It wasn't about medicine. It was about courage, about standing up with dignity, about turning difficult moments into opportunities for change. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the airport authority. They weren't just offering a meeting anymore. They wanted her input on revising their training programs. They wanted to learn to do better. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Looking out her hotel window at the busy Chicago streets below, Maya felt a mix of emotions. She was tired. This wasn't a burden she'd asked to carry. But she was also hopeful. Sometimes the most important changes start with one person simply saying, "This isn't right, and I won't pretend it is." She picked up her phone and finally started responding to messages. Not to the news outlets or the viral video shares, but to the people who'd reached out with their own stories. Because in the end, this wasn't about one incident or one airport. It was about all the quiet moments of discrimination that people faced every day, and the courage it takes to say enough. Officer Barrett sat in the back row of the training room, arms crossed, watching as the diversity consultant wrote on the whiteboard. 2 weeks had passed since the incident, and his uniform was hanging unused in his closet at home. The administrative leave felt like a punishment, but these training sessions were teaching him something he hadn't expected about himself. "Let's talk about unconscious bias," the consultant said, her voice gentle but firm. Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been a security officer for 15 years, priding himself on being fair and professional. But now, watching video after video of similar incidents, he couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. During the lunch break, he sat alone in the cafeteria, stirring his coffee without drinking it. A fellow officer, someone he'd worked with for years, pulled up a chair. "You know," his colleague said quietly, "my daughter got stopped 3 times last month at different stores. Just for shopping. She's 12. Barrett looked up, really looked at his colleague for the first time. They'd worked countless shifts together, shared jokes, covered each other's breaks. But they'd never talked about this. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "I didn't know." Back in the training room, they watched security footage from various airports. Barrett noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. How some travelers were questioned more than others. How subtle differences in body language could make someone feel unwelcome. He thought about Dr. Thompson's calm dignity that day, how she'd stood her ground without losing her composure. At home that evening, Barrett opened his laptop and started reading. Not because the training required it, but because he wanted to understand. He found stories from professionals, students, families, all sharing experiences similar to what had happened with Dr. Thompson. His chest felt tight as he recognized his own behavior in some of these accounts. The next day's session focused on communication skills. The consultant asked them to role-play different scenarios. Barrett felt awkward at first, but as he played the role of a traveler being unnecessarily questioned, something clicked. He felt the frustration, the helplessness, the need to maintain composure even when being treated unfairly. During a coffee break, he overheard 2 younger officers talking about changes they wanted to make in their approach. "It's not about being less secure," one said. "It's about being more human." Barrett found himself nodding, understanding now what he couldn't see before. The training brought in speakers from different backgrounds, successful professionals who shared stories of being profiled. One speaker, a renowned surgeon like Dr. Thompson, described how he still got stopped more often than his colleagues at professional conferences. Barrett thought about all the times he made quick judgments based on appearance, thinking he was just being thorough. In the final week of training, they discussed practical changes. It wasn't about lowering security standards. It was about applying them fairly and treating everyone with respect. Barrett started taking notes, not because he had to, but because he wanted to do better. One evening, as he drove home, he passed the airport where it all happened. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the terminal buildings. He thought about Dr. Thompson, about his colleague's 12-year-old daughter, about all the people he interacted with over his 15 years of service. Had he really been protecting people, or had he been letting his biases create barriers? He pulled into his driveway and sat there for a moment, thinking. Tomorrow would be another day of training, but for the first time since this all began, he wasn't dreading it. He was learning, growing, understanding. And maybe, just maybe, this incident that had seemed like the worst moment of his career would turn out to be the most important one. The moment that made him not just a better officer, but a better person. The community center buzzed with energy as people filled every seat in the large meeting room. 1 month after the airport incident, Dr. Thompson stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. Airport staff, local business owners, community leaders, and concerned citizens had all come together to turn one difficult moment into lasting change. "We're not here to point fingers," Maya began, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "We're here to build bridges." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing statistics about everyday experiences of bias in public spaces. The room grew quiet as people leaned forward, listening. In the front row, the airport's chief of operations nodded along, taking notes. Behind him, a group of security officers, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, watched intently. The atmosphere wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, there was a sense of purpose, of people ready to learn and grow. A small business owner raised her hand during the question period. "This isn't just about airports," she said, her voice slightly shaking. "Last week, I watched a security guard follow my son around our local shopping mall. He's an honor student, but all they saw was..." She paused, emotions visible on her face. Maya nodded understanding. "That's exactly why we're here. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a bigger picture that we can change together." She shared her screen, showing a draft of new training protocols developed with input from civil rights organizations and security experts. The airport had become an unexpected testing ground for these new approaches. Security staff were learning to check credentials consistently for everyone, not just some. They were practicing communication skills that made all travelers feel respected while maintaining necessary security measures. During the lunch break, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories and ideas. A young security officer talked about how the new protocols actually made her job easier. Clear guidelines meant less room for unconscious bias to creep in. A business traveler mentioned feeling a difference already, just 1 month into the changes. "It's like a weight has been lifted," one frequent flyer said, stirring her coffee. "I used to feel tense every time I approached security. Now, I just feel normal." Others around her nodded in agreement. The afternoon session focused on practical solutions. Maya worked with small groups, role-playing different scenarios. They weren't just talking about change. They were practicing it. A retired teacher suggested adapting these training materials for schools. A mall manager asked about implementing similar protocols in retail spaces. As the day went on, something beautiful happened. People who might never have spoken to each other were exchanging contact information, making plans to work together. The incident that could have divided the community was instead bringing it together. Near the end of the day, a young girl approached Maya. "My mom's a pilot," she said proudly. "She says things are different now when she goes through security. They treat her like they treat everybody else." Maya smiled, remembering why all this effort mattered. The local news crew packed up their cameras as the meeting wound down. They'd captured something powerful. Not just people talking about change, but actually making it happen. The story wasn't about one bad experience anymore. It was about a community coming together to ensure better experiences for everyone. As Maya gathered her materials, she noticed people lingering, still deep in conversation. Some were planning future meetings, others were sharing resources and ideas. The energy in the room wasn't angry or sad. It was hopeful, determined, focused on moving forward. Looking around, Maya felt a warmth in her chest. Sometimes the hardest moments in life lead to the most important changes. What had started as a painful experience was growing into something powerful. A movement of people committed to making their community better, one interaction at a time. The small coffee shop near the airport was quiet that afternoon. Maya sat at a corner table, watching steam rise from her cup of green tea. She'd received Officer Barrett's request for a meeting 3 days ago, and after careful thought, she'd agreed. Now, looking through the window at the planes taking off in the distance, she wondered what he would say. The bell above the door chimed softly. Officer Barrett walked in, no longer in his uniform, but wearing a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis. He looked different somehow. Maybe it was the absence of his badge, or maybe it was the way he carried himself, less rigid than before. "Dr. Thompson," he said softly, standing by her table. "Thank you for meeting with me." His hands were slightly shaking as he pulled out the chair. Maya noticed how he waited for her nod before sitting down. "Would you like some coffee?" she offered, trying to ease the tension. He shook his head, then changed his mind and signaled the waitress. "Actually, yes. Black coffee, please." He wiped his palms on his pants, clearly nervous. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "About that day, about my whole career, really." He paused as the waitress set his coffee down, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Maya waited, giving him space to find his words. Through the window, a plane lifted into the sky, reminding her of all the times she'd walked through that airport, all the times she'd felt those subtle stings of bias. "I always told myself I was just doing my job," Barrett continued, looking down at his coffee. "Being thorough, being professional. But the training sessions, they made me see things differently." He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "They made me see myself differently." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their table as he shared stories from the past 6 months. The diversity training, the conversations with colleagues, the late nights spent reading and reflecting. "My daughter asked me the other day why I seemed different," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "I told her I was learning to be better." Maya sipped her tea, listening. She'd seen many apologies in her life, some sincere, others just for show. This felt different. There was a rawness to his words, a genuine understanding that seemed to reach beyond just this one incident. "The hardest part," he admitted, "was accepting that I'd been wrong. Not just that day with you, but so many times before. With so many people." His voice cracked slightly. "I can't change the past, but I want to be part of changing the future." Outside, the afternoon traffic hummed quietly. A family walked past the window, laughing about something. Maya thought about how many small moments like this happened every day. Moments where people could choose to grow, to learn, to be better. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Barrett said, straightening in his chair. "I just wanted you to know that what happened that day, it changed me. And I'm grateful for that change, even though I wish it hadn't taken something like this to open my eyes." Maya set her cup down gently. "Change isn't easy," she said. "But recognizing the need for it is the first step." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I'm working with the airport on their new training program. Would you be interested in sharing your perspective?" Barrett's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected this. "You want my input? After everything?" "Sometimes," Maya said, The most powerful teaching comes from people who've experienced transformation themselves. She opened the folder, revealing outlines for new security protocols and training materials. Your journey could help others understand why change is necessary. As they began discussing ideas, the tension in the air dissolved. They were no longer the officer and the traveler from that difficult day. They were two people working towards something bigger than themselves, something that could make a real difference in countless lives. The training room looked different now. Gone were the rigid rows of chairs and the stern atmosphere. Instead, small groups of security officers sat in circles, engaged in animated discussions. At the front of the room, Maya and Officer Barrett stood side by side, watching their shared vision come to life. Remember, Barrett was saying to the group, his voice carrying the weight of experience, I used to think I was just being careful. But there's a difference between being thorough and being unfair. He clicked to the next slide, showing airport security footage from various checkpoints. A young officer raised her hand. But how do we maintain security while making sure we're being fair to everyone? It was the question they'd all been wondering about, and Barrett nodded appreciatively at her honesty. Maya stepped forward. That's exactly what we're here to figure out together. She pulled up the new protocol handbook they developed. It's not about lowering our standards. It's about applying them equally and treating everyone with respect. The morning session focused on practical scenarios. Officers paired up, taking turns playing different roles. They practiced checking credentials consistently, using the same respectful tone with everyone, and handling difficult situations without letting bias creep in. During the lunch break, Maya overheard two officers talking by the coffee machine. One said, I never realized how much extra stress we were putting on certain travelers. No wonder some people arrived looking tense. Barrett joined them, adding his own perspective. I used to see that tension and think it was suspicious behavior, he admitted. Now I understand we were often creating that tension ourselves. The others nodded, understanding dawning in their eyes. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor, the airport's director of operations. She watched as the officers practiced their new approach, nodding approvingly. Other airports are asking about your program, she told Maya and Barrett during a brief break. They want to implement something similar. As the training continued, something remarkable happened. Officers began sharing their own stories, times they'd noticed bias but hadn't spoken up, moments they now wished they'd handled differently. The room became a space for honest conversation and real learning. Maya watched as Barrett handled these discussions with gentle skill. He transformed from the defensive officer she'd met months ago into someone who could guide others through their own journey of understanding. His story wasn't just about what went wrong. It was about how to make things right. Near the end of the day, they did one final role-playing exercise. This time, it wasn't just about checking credentials or following procedures. It was about seeing the human being in front of them. The tired parent traveling with small children, the nervous first-time flyer, the busy professional just trying to make their flight. The thing is, Barrett told the group as they wrapped up, security isn't just about spotting threats. It's about making everyone feel safe. And you can't make people feel safe if you're making them feel unwelcome. Maya added her final thoughts, looking around the room at faces that now showed understanding instead of resistance. What we're doing here isn't just changing procedures, she said. We're changing the whole culture of how security works. As the officers gathered their things to leave, many stopped to share their thoughts. One mentioned how he'd already started using these approaches during his shifts. Another talked about how much calmer the security checkpoints felt lately. Outside, the sun was setting behind the airport terminals. Maya and Barrett stood by the window, watching planes take off and land. He said quietly, when I first started this training program with you, I thought it was about fixing one mistake. Now I realize it's about making sure that mistake never happens again, not just here, but anywhere. Maya smiled, thinking about how far they'd come from that difficult day 6 months ago. Sometimes, she replied, the best changes come from the hardest moments. Through the glass, they could see travelers moving through security smoothly, officers treating everyone with the same professional respect. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was getting better, one interaction at a time. 1 year later, Maya walked through the familiar airport terminal, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm patterns on the polished floor. Everything looked the same, yet somehow different. As she approached the Sky Lounge entrance, she saw Officer Barrett, now Training Supervisor Barrett, speaking with his team. He looked up and smiled, the kind of genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Dr. Thompson," he called out warmly. "Welcome back." The young officers around him straightened up, recognizing her name. They'd all studied the case during their training, but seeing her in person was different. One of them stepped forward to check her credentials, handling the process with practiced professionalism, the same courteous approach they used with every traveler. "Would you like to see what we've accomplished?" Barrett asked, gesturing toward the security area. Maya nodded, curious to witness the changes firsthand. As they walked, he pointed out the subtle but significant differences in how things operated now. The security checkpoint flowed smoothly. Officers greeted every traveler with the same respectful tone, checked documents with consistent thoroughness, and maintained a calm, professional atmosphere. Gone was the tension that used to hang in the air like an invisible weight. "Watch this," Barrett said quietly, nodding toward a nearby checkpoint. A businessman in an expensive suit was being asked to step aside for additional screening, while a student in casual clothes passed through the regular line. "Random selections are truly random now," he explained. "No more unconscious patterns." They passed a wall covered with feedback cards from travelers. "Best airport experience," one read. "Felt respected," said another. "Professional and fair," noted a third. Maya stopped to read them, remembering how different things had been just 1 year ago. In the staff break room, Barrett introduced her to his diverse team. They shared stories about the impact of the new training program, how it had spread to other airports, how it was being adapted for different security settings, how it had changed their own perspectives about their work. Yesterday, one officer shared, "A traveler told me that this was the first time she didn't feel anxious going through security. That's when I knew we were really making a difference." Others nodded in agreement, adding their own similar experiences. As they walked back toward the lounge, they passed the spot where everything had started 1 year ago. Maya paused for a moment, remembering. Barrett seemed to read her thoughts. "You know," he said, "that day changed more than just our procedures. It changed our whole way of thinking." Inside the Sky Lounge, everything ran with smooth efficiency. The staff treated every member with equal courtesy, checking credentials with consistent care. Maya watched as travelers of all backgrounds moved through the space comfortably, none feeling out of place or unwelcome. A young girl at a nearby table was telling her mother she wanted to be a pilot someday. Maya smiled, thinking about how this next generation might grow up experiencing fewer of the subtle barriers she had faced. "We're not perfect yet," Barrett admitted as they sat down for coffee. "But we're getting better every day." He shared plans for expanding the training program, reaching out to more facilities, touching more lives. "And it all started because you chose to stand up with dignity instead of backing down in anger." Maya looked around the lounge, taking in the peaceful atmosphere. "Sometimes," she replied, "the best response to unfairness isn't to fight back, but to work for change." She watched as a diverse group of travelers shared a table nearby, chatting comfortably like old friends. As the afternoon sun painted the sky in soft colors, Maya prepared to leave for her flight. Barrett walked with her to the lounge exit. "You know what the best part is?" he said, gesturing to the bustling airport around them. "This isn't just about one airport or one incident anymore. It's about showing people everywhere that change is possible." Maya nodded, thinking about all the lives touched by this transformation, What had started as a painful moment had grown into something beautiful. A reminder that even in difficult times, hope and progress were always possible when people chose to work together for change.